Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, with this we are heading towards our next session, Dialogue of the Titans, which revolves around the topic of the big hardware push. This session, ladies and gentlemen, for this session, we have tech pioneer Dr. Ajay Chaudhary ji, commonly known as the father of the nation and father of Indian hardware, father of Indian hardware, along with Mr. Samir Kochhar, Chairman SKOTCH. I request Dr. Ajay Chaudhary ji and Samir Kochhar sir to kindly join us on the stage, please. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ajay Chaudhary co-founded HCL in 1976 with a dream of using the microprocessor and changing the world. Today, HCL is valued $50 billion and he has played a significant role in the establishment of electronic industry in India. His book, Just Aspire, captures the transformation of Indian IT industry as closely watched by him. He dreams of making India Atmanirbhar from designing to manufacturing. How to make India Atmanirbhar in electronics from design to manufacturing is what the core of this conversation between Mr. Samir Kochhar and Padma Bhushan Dr. Ajay Chaudhary. Sir, I request you to kindly begin the session.
Thank you and welcome Ajay. Ajay has been a friend, philosopher and guide for as long as maybe 4 decades for me now. He's of course much more my industry senior, and he was founder of HCL. I was only an employee in PCL, but I've always, and we were like fiercely competing companies, but even from within that position, I had always looked up at him as a marketing genius, innovation genius, and he's been a mentor and a guide for a very long time. So while most of us are aware of the Indian software success story, there seems to be a conspiracy to hide India's hardware success story. It is not there in the Indian memory at all. How many of you are aware that India was a huge hardware manufacturing nation in the 80s and 90s? Does anyone remember that? See, the public memory is very short, and that's why the job of reform historian, and that is the reason why we chose Ajay to come and talk to us today, to talk about how actually the software industry came out of the hardware industry. So Ajay, going back to the 80s, there were a lot of firsts in India. Surface mounted technology was absolutely new. Barely, I think, 6 to 8% of world manufacturing on hardware was on surface mounted technology. But one of the first SMT plants in the world came up in India in Modi Nagar through Modi Oliveti. Did you know that? So, people always refer in a very derogatory term to the 80s as the era of screwdriver technology. So what was that, and what was the Indian prowess in hardware in the 80s, and how did it spawn off the software industry?
Very interesting question, actually. I have written about it a little bit in the past, but as you rightly say, people don't remember. The real revolution in hardware started to happen in the 70s. And HCL was born in 1976. And at that time, import of technology was banned. So you could not import pretty much anything. So the whole idea at that stage was to take the microprocessor and design your own computer, which is really what we did. And our first computer, which came out in 1977-78, was at the same time as when Apple created its first PC. So it's not something that people know about, but since we were a small nation, underdeveloped, people never recognized what we did those days. And the product was literally designed ground up. We designed everything ourselves, the motherboard, the cards, everything was designed by us. The operating system, the relational database, everything was written and designed by us, ground up. And the whole issue is that particular time, imports were just not allowed. So when IBM left the country, we had to really step in very fast to actually fill the void. And we redeveloped our product with a data entry machine to actually make the customers familiar with the way IBM worked. So it's one of those things that we did to actually make the hardware revolution happen. And then after HCL came Wipro and many other companies. And if you look at the history of software companies, HCL software was born out of HCL hardware. Wipro software was born out of Wipro hardware. Infosys, the founders worked in Patni. They worked in hardware. TCS was Tata Burroughs, and the first order for software which TCS got was from Tata Burroughs. So a lot of history which is unknown to people, that software companies came out of hardware because at that time we had to have incredible capability to actually make a hardware work. And that incredible capability was in electronic design and software. And as we went along, the Unix revolution took place. And due to the Unix revolution, all the hardware companies had phenomenal capability in software. And as a matter of fact, I do remember when we went to the US, we actually took our product to the US, hardware product to the US to sell it there. And we did this in 1979. And we opened a factory in Silicon Valley to start selling hardware because McKinsey came to us and said, guys, you have great capability. Why don't you take this product to the US? And we took it to the US. We got business also. And then suddenly we discovered that we didn't meet one specific criteria of the US government. And as a result, our product could not be delivered. But it was manufactured, it was made, we had business worth close to $50 million. So, you know, all that is history. But when we found that we could not sell hardware, we took all our R&D engineers who were actually working on Unix and started putting them inside the R&D of other hardware companies that were working on Unix. As a matter of fact, some of our engineers hold patents in the multiprocessor Unix software of Hewlett-Packard. So that's how the evolution of hardware to software took place.
So it was a fairly hostile environment to work in then. We had this double whammy of very high import duties, very high excise duties. Computers were considered a luxury product. And at the same time, not only was the Indian government discouraging import, the US government was also discouraging export because they were looking at it as a geopolitical threat. India was a part of, let's say, the communist bloc. So there were actually caps on what capacity of computers can be imported by India and what cannot be. And that is where I think we had to develop our own capability to develop multiprocessing hardware computers and to do our own supercomputer to beat that barrier. Could you just go back to some of that? And what kind of geopolitical hostility was there then?
Well, actually, when the software industry started, they had to all apply to import computers. And I remember Narayan Murthy telling me that to get his first computer, it took him 1.5 years. So that's the kind of difficulty there was in importing technology then. And as a result of that, imports were very difficult. So we had to develop our own capability. In a manner, it forced us to develop our own capability. Now you look at our space achievements. Why have the space achievements happened? Because there was sheer control from the West to send technology for space. The same thing happened in nuclear. We developed our own capability. And if you saw the launch of the moon shot that we did last year, did you notice something? That there was not a single IIT engineer out there. They were all nice, simple engineers who had come from other colleges, who created this capability. And we created our own technology in space. And today, India is very well recognized in the world that we can do things in space. And As a result of all of this, opening up of space has created more than 500 startups today in space. This is not something that we saw when we started. There was nothing open. The government was pretty closed. And the duties were so high. And then suddenly, in 1999, the government went and signed the WTO and destroyed the electronics industry.
Right. Just rolling back to the late 80s, do you, I don't know if you remember the names also. They were very formidable Indian brands of computers. There was HCL, which was number one. There was PCL. There was Zenith. There was Shiva Computers. Microland also had a computer. So there were very strong Indian brands, and there was a thriving organized sector. And this thriving organized sector was not just doing screwdriver technology, they were actually doing component level population of motherboards. They were designing their own motherboards. They were getting them made, PCBs made, and then they were being populated and going through the entire cycle here. And India was a very thriving PC market. It was known for its price wars. It was very fiercely price competitive, and that is what opened up the market. Now, once the market opened up, there is obviously a vested agenda of, let's say, Western countries at that time, or even countries like Taiwan and so on and so forth, that how can India grow in hardware? What is it that can be done? So the biggest threat that came to Indian hardware manufacturing was not from the multinationals. The first big threat that came was from the grey market. Now, these were people who would just smuggle things. They'll, hand carry RAM in their pocket and bring in PCBs, and in Nehru Place used to be the biggest. So PC manufacturing in a way was a cottage industry then, and they were substantially cheaper than the hardware sector because they had zero excise duty, they had very little custom duty, and they did not have to pay any loyalty for operating system. So how did we tackle that and how difficult that was? And the problem then was, you're saying, so HCL is a big brand, PCL is a big brand. How do we leverage brand to fight this? And lo and behold, we find that a very big American brand got all these guys together and give them their logo. Some of them legitimately or illegitimately were called genuine Intel dealers. So they got a brand which was Intel and actually assembled in Nehru Place.
So actually that was a very difficult period for all the branded products because the typical home buyer was only attracted by price. And they didn't realize what they were getting into because pretty much 1 to 2 years later, the product will fail and parts won't be available and service won't be available. All those issues were there for them. But they would not listen at that time. They would buy and then suffer. So this is exactly how the branded products kept up with them by offering a range of products, offering the latest technology, offering service all over the country, and also offering a deep understanding of how solutions can be connected to hardware. So we had to really improvise and innovate to overcome those problems, and we did. But the market still thrived, and it's not that it ended up getting closed. And the two things worked parallelly in a lot of ways. So it's that kind of an era when these kind of evolutions happen in any country, and it's not India was all alone in this. Every country was having something similar.
So then came the Indian hardware export story, which is completely incredible. I don't think anyone can imagine in early 90s, India was actually a hardware exporter. Pentium was a very new technology. You heard of a brand called Dell? In early 90s, 40% of Dell Pentium motherboards were manufactured in Gurgaon, in Udyog Vihar. There was a first lot of order, which was $50 million worth of Dell motherboards, on completely robotics-based lines, world-class standards were manufactured in Gurgaon. HCL was also manufacturing motherboards. Tandon was manufacturing UPS in India. HCL was, of course, designing and selling multi-processing Unix-based systems. And since there was a trade embargo on the communist bloc, a lot of manufacturing for the Russian bloc countries was also done in India, and through rupee trade, it was going to the Eastern Bloc. So any recollections of that export-led growth of that time and how India was leveraging that capability?
Actually, at that time, I think PCL made a fantastic breakthrough to get this deal from Dell, and that created a pretty much standard. So other companies also started to looking at that, how they can also come to India and get their products manufactured. So there were lots of follow-on orders also that happened. But the interesting part is that the market for Indian products also opened up into the CIS bloc and the Russian bloc, etc., because it became much easier for them to buy through the rupee route. And I think that opened up a completely new market. And when various countries in Africa were also at that time opening up. And as I told you earlier, in 79-80, we went to the US to sell hardware. So we started selling our hardware made in India in 1980. We were born in 77. We went to Singapore and we created a manufacturing plant there for making computers. So, you know, a lot of innovation and lot of new thinking went into creating the hardware business those days. And we had the guts to go and do things like this. And that's really what makes an industry.
So around this time, you know, the size of Indian market was less than 1 million PCs per year. I mean, maybe 700,000, 800,000 PCs is what India used to buy. 60% of that used to be in the grey market. So what was left for the organized sector was only this much, and you had so much of marketing muscle and organized sector and branding spend going on to capture that and survive. At the same time, we saw emergence of the software industry through the formation of NASSCOM, and around the time, you know, this narrative started floating around that actually China has stolen the hardware march. So what we should do is that we should let China walk away with the hardware and India should do only software. I don't know who does this kind of agenda setting, because hardware and software are completely complementary to each other. But there was a policy choice put in front of the government which had little capacity to understand that there was really no trade-off. People, again, pursuing a Western agenda, went to the government and said, you can either do hardware or you can do software, and no one could explain why. And no one bothered because it was fashionable, it was, and I recall Ajay had gone to meet one of the IT ministers and he was told that there is no hardware story for India, and he was telling to the largest hardware manufacturer in India.
Yeah, I went to his house and he said, what would you like to discuss? So I said, we've come from MATE, which was the Association of Hardware Producers. And then we started to give him a presentation on MATE, and this is what we've done, this is what we've achieved, this is what we want to do, these are the kind of policies we need to promote hardware. And he turned around and said, software तो इतना अच्छा चल रहा है, hardware की ज़रूरत ही क्या है? It all went down that way. And look at what's happened to us in the last 30 years. We are importing everything in electronics today. And at one time, I had written a proposal to the government and I had said, guys, start to think deeply how hardware will be required tomorrow. I had clearly stated that the import bill for electronics will be higher than the oil bill. And every minister and everybody quoted me. But it happened.
Yeah, and it's still happening. And if you look at the geopolitical dimension of it, it's for electronics is very, very adverse for India, and we have to catch up and catch up. very fast. So there was this entire environment that was created. That hardware is a very good thing, let China do it. And software will be done by India. And therefore, since software development needs hardware, we should allow free import of hardware. And in 1997, we shot ourselves in the foot and signed ITA, Information Technology Agreement, which said that there is zero duty on hardware imports into India. Now, I would have accepted that if in return we had got free flow of manpower from India to the Western world to develop software. Well, one of the most restrictive tariff regimes that we accepted is this visa-based regime that India got. So there was a caste of players, you should not criticize the dead, so I would not name them, who actually very actively worked to do this trade-off, that for a particular quota of visas, that if we give all the Indian market to the American companies and Chinese companies, then India will get so many software visas and the software visa will thrive. Well, India should have got unlimited software visas. That did not happen. So one by one, you see the demise of legendary Indian brands. In 2003, Bajpayee ji went to China and he came back and he talked about the same thing, that China hardware might and India software. And that was the time, again, for the second time, people like Ajay were trying to revive Indian hardware industry. There was some story, but again, the duty structures were inverse. The excise duty was so high and the grey market still rampant. And in 2003, there was zero excise duty on manufacturing a mobile phone. And there was, I think, 26% or 16% or something like that for on PCs. Now, what is the logic? So consistently you find that every time India has tried to emerge as a hardware nation, as a hardware exporting nation, there is this whole series of people who crop up following a manufacturing, anti-manufacturing agenda on behalf of the West and WTO and multilateral institutions, and make sure that India remains hardware poor. The reason why I am giving you such a long story is in context of, you would have recently sought, there is a very, 6 months back, there was a book, very popular, this book called Just Aspire by Ajay Chaudhary. He talked about all these things that I've talked about and the HCL journey, and he's laid a roadmap for how India can become a hardware manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing nation again. And I was taking extreme pride in it, and I think that the government policy is following in step with what Ajay is saying. We once again want to revive the hardware industry, and a lot of things are taking care. He's also established something called the EPIC Foundation, which is going to be promoting Indian hardware industry. Till about 2 months back, there was this book that came out, Breaking the Mold, from a very respected economists Raghuram Rajan and Rohit Lamba, who talked about why manufacturing cannot happen in India. Hardware manufacturing cannot happen in India. Came down heavily on the PLI being given for cell phone manufacturing and for chip fabrications. He is completely oblivious of the fact of the glorious history of the late 80s and early 90s of India's manufacturing prowess. Had he been aware of that, there would not have been such a defeatist attitude on whether India has a design, manufacture, domestic consumption, as well as export story on high-end manufacturing. Even today, if you look at the whole world is moving towards artificial intelligence. Do you know what is the biggest input into artificial intelligence? It's supercomputers. That only 500 of those which are capable of doing artificial intelligence kind of work. Out of those 500, How many are there in India? Maybe 3 or 4. And are they accessible? They may be in meteorological department or stat. So if somebody wants to do AI or LLM kind of work in India, there is no compute capacity available. There was a time when India made its own supercomputer under CDAC to fight Cray. There was a time when the cheapest cost of landline was in India because India was manufacturing its own PABXs, EPABXs and C dot. PC's multiprocessing power was possibly the cheapest in India, working on open operating systems like Unix, unlike the proprietary systems that everybody else was selling. So we have a glorious history of design, manufacture, export of hardware. And he's saying that we don't have a history. I mean, whatever Ajay said in his book, he said exactly the opposite in his book. And since it's a lit fest, so while we celebrate a book, we also have the liberty to critique the other. And
may I just add one point here, which I think people forget to look at. If you look at NASSCOM figures for exports of software, it says $250 billion. Absolutely amazing story. But within the 250 billion is sitting a figure of $39 billion, which is R&D and engineering exports. This R&D and engineering exports came out of the hardware capability of HCL, Wipro, and then Infosys got into it, TCS got into it. This 39 billion is also including all the global competence centers that are here that are designing hardware. As a matter of fact, most people don't know that 30-40% of Intel's processors are designed in India. Okay, the same goes for Broadcom, the same goes for Cisco, the same goes for many of these GCCs that are in India. So that 39 billion only shows the transfer price of the global companies. It doesn't show the market price. If you actually look at the market price of our design and engineering capability, it is 100 billion. We ourselves don't know. And this is something nobody has pointed out. No newspaper or media has talked about it, that we have the capability of exporting $100 billion worth of VLSI design, engineering design, embedded systems. All of this is hardware. And this is something that we don't know because it's hidden inside the NASSCOM agenda. Okay, so I have been telling the government, this is our capability. Why can't we use this capability to design for India rather than just leave it for exports?
And to be able to do this, what Ajay is saying, 39 billion to 100 billion, it's a big gap. And this 39 billion is, by the way, not coming to India or Indian companies. It's going to the global competence centers of the same company. So there is a profit transfer. It's not all IP sits there. And the balance 100 billion also sits there. And to be able to design and manufacture all these things in India, what do we need? Anyone knows what we need? We need a silicon fab. It is a strategic, important thing for India to have its own fabrication unit for chips and VLSIs. We've tried for 40 years to bring fab into India. For the first time, the current government has succeeded. And there is a fab being set up in India. The cost of getting that done is obviously enormous. You have to give a lot of incentive to a fab company to come to such a late entrant in the game when everybody and his neighbor has already got fab. And that incentive, which is going to make India an electronic export powerhouse, is what is analyzed and criticized in this book. So I don't know with what kind of a fistful of salt you take that. So instead of that, the remedy that is being proposed is that India should become from agricultural economy or primary economy to services economy. Let's just leapfrog. Let's not do manufacturing at all. And then we say that we have actually two areas where we can be successful. One area is what is defined as incremental innovation. We cannot innovate, but we can incrementally innovate. Incremental innovation is like you take pharmaceutical industry and you take a patent and you tweak the process and you make a generic medicine. So say India is very good at doing that. So we can pick up IP from the West, we can tweak it and we can incrementally innovate on that. And that's what we are very good at doing. He says India is not good at innovation. What about UPI? What about Aadhaar? What about all the spaceships that we're doing? What about atomic energy? What about the green energy? I mean, you can give innumerable number of examples where India has taken a global lead, is better than the best. Why do they feel that we are only an incremental innovation nation? So we have to be not an incremental innovation nation, we have to be a finished product innovation nation, which is some of the work that Ajay is doing, and I'll ask him to talk about it now. So how is it that you are now participating in public policy and through EPIC Foundation to make that dream into a reality?
So actually, if you look at it, we have been numbed by the 250 billion software exports. हम लोग बहुत खुश हैं कि संतुष्ट हैं, जैसे एक ऐड आता है ना, संतुष्ट हैं हम बहुत संतुष्ट हैं कि हमने सर्विसेज में कमाल कर दिया. अरे भाई, अब देखिए, द सिचुएशन इन इंडिया इज दैट एवरी एरिया वी आर ओनली इन सर्विसेज. एवरी एरिया. I'll recount 5 or 7 for you. Diamond cutting. We are the largest diamond cutting country in the world. But where is the value? The value is not in diamond cutting. The value is sitting in making diamond cutting machines, which is what China does. What happened to garments? We were a huge exporting country in garments, right? Today, China exports $220 billion worth of garments. What does India do? 40 billion and going down. Everything is going to Bangladesh. Because all of this is cost-based. Every service business that we are in is cost-based. It will all vanish. It will all go away to countries that are cheaper in everything that we are doing, whether it's pharmaceuticals. Look at airlines. We have so many airlines, but do we make a single aircraft? The value is in making aircraft in Boeing and Airbus. It doesn't sit in airline business. Which airline makes money? Very few. So the challenge that India faces is that we say that we should remain in services. I think the direction is totally wrong because we are having headwinds on services. If AI and ChatGPT start attacking the software business, what will happen? No more programming is required. No more, whole bunch of things that are today being done by software services business is no longer required. So,
what is still required is lots of hardware.
Yeah. So, fundamental issue is that from services, we need to move to a product nation. Whether it's electronics, whether it's drones, whether it is space, whether it is quantum computers, whether it is telecom, we need to be a product nation. We cannot remain a services nation. If we remain a services nation, we will get destroyed in the next 10 years. So it's a very big question that India needs to face and take action on. The interesting part is that few of us got together about 6 months ago, and we all said, look, this is a disaster waiting to happen. Right, the software hardware story was well known. But there's other stories also which disaster is waiting to happen. So we went to the government, started talking with many secretaries to the government, to a couple of ministers also, and we presented this whole idea and said, we must become a product nation in everything we do. And the good news is the government is listening. So the point about this government is that they're very quick to understand the issue. But there's still lot of naysayers within the government who are saying, "Ye to galat baat hai." So, this is exactly what happened in when we proposed a fab 30 years ago, everyone from all over the world, including NRIs, came and told the government, आप क्यों time waste कर रहे हो fab लगाने में? Fabless companies शुरू करो. Fabless companies तो शुरू हो गई इंडिया में, but सारे के सारे chips जो हैं manufacture होते हैं बाहर. So if you look at 5 years ago, 6 years ago, this American intelligence guy in the Senate, he made a fantastic statement. He said, the next wars will be fought with semiconductors. And we started to suddenly realize this during COVID. All of you faced the problem of not getting your phones on time. All of you faced the problems of not getting your washing machines on time, your cars on time. Why did it happen? Because India makes 0 semiconductors. And that is why it happened. So this is really what we need to look at as a country. We need to move and move very fast. There's no way we'll catch up with the US. No way we'll catch up with China in semiconductors. But we must become self-sufficient. For that, the government has taken the right decision to go not for the latest chips, but for the chips that are required for Indian requirements, like automobiles, washing machines, the volume products. So we are trying to set up plants which are 28 nanometers and above. We don't need 5 and 7 nanometers which go into a phone. Let somebody else do it. And the cost to create a fab in the 5 to 7 is around $20 billion. The cost to create a fab in 28 nanometers is somewhere around $5 to $10 billion. Easy for India. Now, in this particular book, I sort of read some pieces of it, and they criticize the fact that we are giving incentives for semiconductor companies to come to India. Let me explain why that is happening. Today, America has realized that they have lost the semiconductor battle to China and Taiwan. They make nothing. Intel designs it there, China makes it, or Taiwan makes it. Broadcom designs there, China makes it, or Taiwan makes it. NVIDIA designs there, it is all made outside of America. Suddenly, the government in America realized that they have bereft of critical product like semiconductor, and during COVID, they suddenly understood the supply chain has become ridiculous. It's completely out of America. So suddenly, America is setting up 40, 50 semiconductor plants. The same thing is true for Europe. The same thing is true for Japan. So the same thing is true for Korea. Now, all these guys are competing with us to set up a semiconductor plant. If we don't give incentives the way the government has decided, शुरू में क्या होता था 5 साल 7 साल पहले, the incentives for semiconductors were, if you come to India and you spend $5 billion, 2 years later, we will refund 30% to you. The new policy is that if you spend $5 billion, I'll give you $2.5 billion at the same time as you invest. It changed the whole picture. And it was necessary to do something like this. This book criticizes the fact that we are over-giving these incentives. You please ask a question to yourself. If some 200 companies all over the world are vying to set up semiconductor plants, who will come to India? If we don't give incentives? Nobody's going to come. They're not interested. They'll keep exporting to India. They do not want India to be successful. And that's the same old hardware story of the past. They do not want India to be successful. China definitely doesn't want India to be successful. So I think the matter is just not understood. And a lot of people unnecessarily criticize the government without knowing what is really happening.
And also it's important to, I think, recognize as the same cast of characters over the years who pushed WTO, they pushed ITA, they pushed TRIPS, and they're still lamenting RCEP, the China-led thing that India should have been a part of that and let China walk away with the cream, and India is left with the crumbs, so to say. And the reason why we decided to pick up Ajay's book to feature in the LitFest and invited him to come and talk to all of us is to once again remind India, the the glorious past we've had on hardware and the glorious future that awaits us. I'd say God's blessings be added to Ajay Chaudhary's work. He's been doing a big round of applause for Ajay, please. And we've also decided to honor some of his work, so that's coming next.
Thank you so much, gentlemen on stage, for this illuminating session. Devya Sajanu,